Hey guys, how are y'all? Coming to you live from my house. I'm going to talk to y'all about another topic. We're going to move on with our review videos into biological basis. So all of the stuff about the brain, the neurons, action potential, all of that fun stuff. So I'm going to kind of do the same thing that I did last time. I'm going to click through the PowerPoint and point out some of the most important things to you. Hopefully this one will be less than 23 minutes. If not, I might practice my editing skills and cut some stuff out to make it a little bit shorter. But hey, we've got nothing but time, right? So make sure you have your spiral out as you're listening and you're taking down any notes that you want to add, anything that you don't remember, and we want to just jot those down. So biological basis is another really big unit. It's a huge possibility that something about the brain or neurons will be on your AP test with the FRQ section. So I would pay attention to this one and check everything out. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Same process as last time. I'm going to show you my PowerPoint. Gotta figure out how to not cut my head off. So we're working on that. I'm trying to move the little box to see if that helps. Okay, so let's get started. You've got to remember the neuron, right? Your neuron is going to have multiple parts, and this is where in class I made you do the weird thing with your body where your left hand was your dendrites, and that was right up against your body like this, and your body represented the cell body or the soma. And then you stretched your arm all the way out, and that was the axon. And then at the end of the axon, you stretched your right hand out really wide because these were the terminal branches. And then your fingertips were the terminal buttons, right? So that's your neuron. It's hard to do it on video, but make sure you go through and remember those different things. Those different parts of the neuron and what their job is. So remember, dendrites is the receiving end. The terminal branches and buttons are the senders. That's where your neurotransmitters are going to leave and cross that synaptic gap. We have your phases of communication with your neurons. You have your action potential. So that is where the neuron is actually firing. That message is traveling through the axon and they're moving from neuron to neuron. Then you have your refractory period. So this is after something has fired, the neuron has to rest. So you fire and then rest, and then you're in a resting potential until something causes that neuron to fire again. So you want to make sure that you remember the difference between action potential, refractory period, and resting period. And remember the positive and negative ions as they are in the neuron. This is where I really wish I had a screen that I could write on. In your terminal buttons, you have the neurotransmitters, and those are going to cross the synaptic gap. And obviously there's way more neurotransmitters than these, but this is kind of our list of neurotransmitters that we use the most in here. So make sure you do a quick review of those and what each neurotransmitter does. We started in disorders talking about how these can affect your mental state. And so going back over these will help not only understand biological basis, but some of those disorders that we didn't really get to finish talking about because of online learning. You have neurotransmitters and then what it looks like if something else kind of gets in the way. So you have that antagonist or that agonist, and those are things that either allow neurotransmitters to keep crossing that synaptic gap or stop it. And these are drugs usually. Let's keep going. I'm going to skip a lot, I know, but it's a review. So in our nervous system, remember, it's broken down into two different parts. You have your central nervous system, which is just the brain and the spinal cord, and that's it. That's by itself. And then you have your peripheral nervous system, and then that's the one that's going to break down into smaller nervous systems after that. So It first breaks down into somatic or autonomic, and autonomic is just what it sounds. It sounds like automatic, right? And so these are the organs in your body that are self-regulating, that you don't have to think to make them work. Like, for example, I'm not having to think about my lungs breathing, they're doing it by themselves. But then you also have somatic, and that's voluntary muscle movement. So the movement I just did with my hand, or like messing with my hair, right? That is voluntary, and so that falls under somatic. And then that gets broken down even more into the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. Remember, that is your, I don't know where that slide is. That is your flight or fight response. That's the sympathetic. That's where your body is, everything is increasing, right? You're tense. And then parasympathetic is bringing you back down to homeostasis. The endocrine system falls in this section. So I would go back, if you're not familiar with that, maybe do a little bit of reading in your textbook or looking over your notes. Y'all seemed pretty solid about that in class because you get a lot of it in biology. But if you're like, Ms. Thompson, endocrine system, what are you talking about? I would do a little review on that. So another part in this unit is breaking the brain down into different parts. The oldest part of the brain, or the older brain, is that brain stem. So that's the part of the brain that's at the very bottom, and it attaches to your spinal cord. And it's made up of multiple different parts, one being the medulla, which is your regulator, right? That's what keeps you alive, your heart beating, you breathing, all of that stuff. You have the pons, reticular formation, thalamus, and cerebellum. For some reason, people don't really remember cerebellum. That is your balance, movement, coordination, your ability to ride a bike, but then also your ability to write with a pencil. Those really small, precise movements are found in your cerebellum. Your thalamus is like the airport of your brain for sensory information. That's where all the information from your senses and your sensory neurons go in, and then they get placed to all the different parts of the brain. So on the next slide, I kind of have some descriptions of these if you need to go back and look that over and write some stuff down. The next more evolved part of your brain is the limbic system. This is the part when we talk about our emotions, right? It's going to be coming out of this system. You have your amygdala, hypothalamus, and hippocampus. So y'all were pretty solid on these, but your amygdala, that's your fear and aggression center. Your hypothalamus is kind of it's really linked to your endocrine system and helps regulate hormones. That dopamine reward system comes out of the hypothalamus, and then it maintains different functions and regulations of eating, drinking, body temperature. And then your hippocampus is memory, right? That's where your short-term memory is stored and new memories are formed. So you want to be looking at that. That's not a thing that you want to damage. That can cause you a lot of trouble. And then you have your cerebral cortex, and your brain is split into two different hemispheres. You have right and left. Don't ever say they have two brains. You don't. You have one brain split into two parts. They are connected by that corpus callosum, which, remember, that can be cut and your brain still functions well. But it's going to have those different lobes. You're going to have the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. Frontal lobe is that personality, judgment, organization, personality. I already said that. Your parietal lobe is going to be perception and movement. Your motor cortex is going to be there. Your temporal lobe on the side is going to be a lot of hearing and auditory processing. And then your occipital lobe, which is in the back, is going to be your vision. So if you have a headache in the front, it's not your eyes that are hurting, right? If your eyes are hurting, it would be in your occipital lobe in the back. We have our motor cortex. Remember, the motor cortex and the sensory cortex are like two nice headbands across the top of your brain. Motor cortex obviously controls your movements. And then if you need precise control of something, so like I said, writing or knitting, that part of your motor cortex is going to be a lot larger than something that doesn't need as much precise control. And that is the same thing with your sensory cortex as well. Parts of your body that are the most sensitive have the most space on the cortex. So think about those parts of your body that are way more sensitive. They're going to have a lot more room on that cortex. And then you also have a visual cortex and an auditory cortex as well. Like I said, you can see in this picture, it's like a nice headband, right, for these two main cortexes. You have some characteristics of the different hemispheres. So your left hemisphere is going to hold more of your language capabilities, like your Broca's area and Wernicke's area. It's going to be in that hemisphere. And then your right hemisphere is more for kind of all like seeing the whole picture, more for your spatial reasoning, face recognition, all of that stuff. Here's a little bit more on if they split the corpus callosum, that it still works. And then brain plasticity. We forget this one sometimes, but if a part of the brain is damaged, other parts of the brain try to kind of step up to help out and kind of overcompensate for that area that has been hurt. And sometimes it can even like rebuild new neural pathways that have been damaged or destroyed. And that's a really cool thing that your brain is able to do. So for example, if you lose one of your senses, like if you lose sight, usually after that, all of your other senses are heightened because your brain is now allowed to give more focus to the 4 other senses because it isn't divided another way. Let's see what else. How do we test brain functions, DNA, all of that stuff? You guessed it. We're always going to be looking at identical twins because remember, fraternal twins are really no different than siblings. You shared a womb, which is cool, but you didn't share the same placenta. So, and you didn't share the egg and the sperm. So it's just like siblings. So in psychology, we're always going to look at identical twins and compare the nature element of some of these things in psychology. Epigenetics, we talk about this a little bit in disorders, but just remember that genes can be like self-regulating. Some can be turned on and some can be turned off. And so for example, addiction and drugs and some sort of like environmental factors can have control over this. Diet, stress, trauma. Like you've probably heard that trauma can be passed down. It has to do with this idea of epigenetics of being able to turn on certain genes and turn off certain genes. So if you see that like on the FRQ, you can talk about it that way. And then the rest of the PowerPoint is just kind of about like evolution, mating, male and female. That stuff I would say is a little bit less important. Usually when they're picking stuff out of this unit, it's going to be about the brain, about the neurons, about the neurotransmitters. So the first half of this PowerPoint I would say is probably a little bit more important than those last couple slides. One thing I want to chat about just real quick, I kind of skipped over it. I'm going to scoot back to types of neurons. So we have sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons. Sensory neurons are obviously neurons that carry sensory information. Motor neurons are neurons that carry movement. And then interneurons are the neurons that travel back and forth between your spinal cord and your brain. They keep going back and forth. So let's say that you are putting your finger over a candle, not in the flame, but you're like putting it over the flame and it starts to get hot. Well, those sensory neurons are going to take the idea of, oh, my finger is heating up. I feel that. That's your touch sensory, right? And so that is going to travel to your spinal cord. So the sensory neurons are going to go from your skin to your spinal cord. And then your inner neurons are going to take that information from your spinal cord up to your brain. We've got to interpret it, right? Your brain is like, oh, that's hot. You should probably move your finger. And so then that message has to get back to your spinal cord. So the inner neurons take it back to the spinal cord, and then the spinal cord activates the motor neurons that travel back to your finger and then allow you to move your finger off the flame, right? So it's that 5-step process. You've got your sensory neurons to your spinal cord, inner neurons from your spinal cord to your brain, inner neurons back from your brain to your spinal cord, and then your motor neurons from your spinal cord back to your finger. Now, sometimes you can have a reflex where the sensory neurons just get sent to your spinal cord and then the motor neurons get sent right back. This is the idea, like I was curling my hair this morning and my finger touched the curling iron and I jerked my finger back really fast before I could even think about it. That's a reflex. So the reflexes don't use your inner neurons. That's just sensory and motor. But if you don't have that reflex movement, it's going to involve all 3 of the neurons. So I just wanted to do a quick overview of that. Woohoo! Biological basis. Let me know if you have any questions about that. I do want to put some practice out there for you, but I'm also trying to not overload you because I know that you're trying to figure out online learning and trying to get everything done for all of your other classes. So just give me a shout out if you're like super concerned and just really, really, really want some extra practice on things. But I'll be around. I'll be making more review videos. I'm praying that this one is a lot shorter. But then again, we got nothing but time. So like I always say, get outside, do something nice today, do something that makes you feel pretty today or handsome or whatever. And I'll be in touch. Bye, y'all.